May 12, 1944. Southern England. Rain hammering the tents. The maps were wrong, not slightly wrong, not needs updating wrong, catastrophically, lethally wrong, the kind of wrong that gets entire divisions killed before breakfast. A reconnaissance pilot, call sign Red Wing, 22 years old, flying so low over Normandy that he could see laundry hanging in farmhouse yards, had returned with film canisters that, when developed in a blacked-out trailer outside Portsmouth, revealed something no one in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force wanted to see: reinforced concrete emplacements, dug into the cliffs above what would soon be called Omaha Beach, that did not exist on any Allied chart, not marked, not suspected, not planned for. The photographs showed angular shadows, the telltale geometry of poured concrete and rebar, half buried in coastal scrub, structures designed to be invisible from the sea, structures built to survive naval bombardment, and worse, structures positioned to enfilade the entire landing zone with interlocking fields of fire. If those guns were still operational on June 6th, the invasion would turn into a killing floor. The problem wasn't just that. The bunkers existed. The problem was that no one knew how many there were, where exactly they were sited, what they were armed with, or whether they were decoys. The Luftwaffe had stopped flying reconnaissance over the Channel weeks ago, which meant German engineers had been working in near total secrecy. Every cliff, every dune, every hedgerow could be hiding steel and concrete, and there were 5 weeks left. Before we go further, take a second and subscribe, because every week we uncover the engineering, the raids, and the impossible decisions that kept entire campaigns from collapsing. This is one of those stories. Supreme Headquarters was a converted manor house near Southwick, cold even in May, filled with officers who hadn't slept in days. The walls were covered in maps annotated in grease pencil, tide charts, weather reports, supply manifests. Eisenhower had already delayed the invasion once. There was no room for another delay. The tides, the moon, the weather, everything had to align. And now this. Brigadier General Harold Travers, Corps of Engineers, stood in front of a corkboard covered with the recon photos, each one marked with red thread connecting suspected bunker positions. Travers was 51, a veteran of the Meuse-Argonne, a man who had rebuilt bridges under artillery fire and knew what happened when assumptions met reality. He had been awake for 36 hours. His coffee had gone cold 3 times. "We're not storming those beaches blind," he said. The room was silent. Everyone knew what he was suggesting. It was insane. "You want to send engineers into France," someone said. "Now. I want to send engineers into France to map every one of those positions, calculate their firing solutions, and get the coordinates back to naval gunfire. Control before June 5th. If we know where they are, we can flatten them before the first landing craft hits the water. If we don't, we lose the beach. Travers, we don't have clearance for..." "Then get clearance." They got clearance. The team was assembled in 48 hours, 12 men, all Corps of Engineers, all volunteers, though volunteer in May 1944 meant you raised your hand when asked, not because you wanted to, but because someone had to. They were pulled from different units: bridge builders, demolitions experts, a geology surveyor from Montana who had worked copper mines before the war, a draftsman from Chicago who could sketch fortifications from memory. None of them spoke fluent French. 2 of them had never jumped out of an airplane. They would be dropped 8 miles inland from the Normandy coast at night, in occupied territory, with no backup and no extraction plan, until after D-Day. Their mission: locate, measure, and document every bunker within the planned landing zones, then get the intelligence back to England before June 5th, when the naval bombardment plan would be finalized. They had 2 weeks. Their commanding officer was Captain Raymond Keller, 34, a civil engineer from Pennsylvania who had spent the last year building airstrips in North Africa. Keller was not a commando. He was not trained for sabotage or espionage. He was trained to look at dirt, rock, and concrete and understand what could be built, what could hold, and what could be destroyed. That was the skill they needed. On May 18th, the team was briefed in a sealed room inside a Quonset hut at an airbase in Dorset. The walls were bare, except for a single large-scale map of the Calvados coast. Keller stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, pointing to overlays marked with suspected enemy positions. "These are the sites we know about," he said. "There are more. We don't know how many. We don't know if they're armed. We don't know if they're even finished. But if they are, and if they open up on June 6th, the whole thing falls apart. One of the men, Sergeant Louis, Sergeant Pryor, Demolitions from Oregon, raised his hand. What if we just blow them? We can't, Keller said. Not without knowing what's inside. Some of these positions are designed to survive 500-pound bombs. If we waste ordnance on decoys, we'll have nothing left for the real ones. We need to know what we're hitting. So we walk up and knock, something like that. They dropped on the night of May 21st. The C-47 flew without lights, low over the channel, engines throttled back to reduce noise. The jump was at Odo 200 hours, moonless. The land below a patchwork of dark fields and darker hedgerows. The drop zone was a pasture 3 kilometers south of Vierville-sur-Mer, marked by resistance fighters with coded lamp signals. Keller hit the ground hard, rolled, cut his chute, and lay still for 30 seconds, listening. Distant dogs, wind in the trees, nothing close. He found his rifle, checked his compass, and moved toward the rally point, a stone barn marked on the map as Juliet. By 02:30, 10 of the 12 men had made it to the barn. The other 2 landed a kilometer east and linked up by dawn. The resistance contact was a woman in her 40s, gaunt, who spoke no English but handed Keller a folded paper with updated German patrol routes. She pointed northwest. Keller nodded. She disappeared. They moved at night, sleeping in root cellars and hedgerows during the day, living on rations and whatever the resistance could spare. Black bread, hard cheese, water, that tasted like rust. The first bunker was found on May 23rd, half a kilometer inland from what would become Dog Green sector. It was bigger than the photo suggested. A reinforced concrete casemate, walls 1.5 meters thick, sloped to deflect shells, camouflaged with sod and scrub. The entrance was a narrow steel door set into the rear wall, locked, but the ventilation shaft was accessible. Sergeant Pryor, smallest on the team, squeezed through with a flashlight. Inside, a 75mm anti-tank gun on a pivot mount, ammunition stored in wooden crates stenciled with Wehrmacht markings, firing slit facing directly down the beach approach. The slit was narrow, maybe 30 centimeters wide, but the arc of fire covered half a kilometer of shoreline. Pryor sketched the interior on graph paper, measured the walls with a tape, checked the gun's traverse limits, then climbed back out. Keller took the sketch, compared it to the aerial photo, and marked the position on his map with a red circle and a notation. Active, primary threat, require naval suppression. They found 11 more in the next 4 days. Not all of them were finished. Some were empty, reinforcing steel exposed. No guns mounted yet, but 6 were fully operational, each one covering a different segment of beach. The Germans had done what good engineers always do when under-resourced. They didn't try to defend everything. They defended the kill zones, the places where men would be slowest, most exposed, least able to take cover, the places where a single gun could stop an entire company. Keller's team mapped them all. They noted distances, angles, fields of fire, blind spots. They measured wall thickness to estimate what kind of ordnance would be required to neutralize each position. They avoided German patrols by moving through drainage ditches and old hunting trails that didn't appear on any map. Twice they came within 100 meters of Wehrmacht positions and froze, wading in mud, until the soldiers passed. On May 27th, they were nearly compromised. A German patrol, 6 men, routine sweep, came through a hedgerow while Keller's team was resting in a sunken lane. No time to run. Pryor and 2 others flattened against the north wall. Keller and the rest went south, rifles ready, safeties off. The Germans passed within 3 meters, talking, smoking, unaware. One of them stopped, directly above Pryor, and lit a cigarette. The flame illuminated his face for 2 seconds. Pryor didn't breathe. The German finished his cigarette, flicked it into the lane, and moved on. Pryor waited 10 minutes before he moved again. By June 1st, they had documented 17 bunker positions, 8 of them armed and operational. The intelligence was compiled into a single hand-drawn map, annotated with coordinates, dimensions, and threat assessments. It was the most detailed enemy fortification map the Allies had for that sector. Now they had to get it back to England. The original plan had been to radio the coordinates to a listening post in Portsmouth, but German signals intelligence had been jamming Allied frequencies for weeks. Any sustained transmission would be triangulated in minutes. The backup plan Rendezvous with a British motor torpedo boat off Point du Hoc on the night of June 3rd. They moved west parallel to the coast, traveling only at night. The air smelled like salt and wet earth. Somewhere out there, the largest armada in history was preparing to cross the channel. The men didn't talk about it. They just walked. On the night of June 2nd, they reached the cliffs above Point du Hoc. The bunkers here were different, bigger. Some of them housed 150 mm coastal guns, capable of hitting ships 10 kilometers offshore. The Germans had poured enormous resources into this position because it dominated both Utah and Omaha beaches. If those guns weren't taken out, the entire western flank of the invasion would collapse. Keller stared at the fortifications through binoculars. Concrete, steel, overlapping arcs of fire. This wasn't just a defensive position. It was a fortress. "We need to add this to the report," he said. They climbed down the cliffs in the dark, measured what they could from the exterior, and updated the map. Then they moved to the rendezvous point, a narrow beach between two rock outcroppings, sheltered from observation but exposed to the tide. The MTB was supposed to arrive at 0200 hours. At 0145 they heard engines, German engines, a patrol boat, small, fast, running dark along the coast. Keller signaled his men to stay low. The boat passed 100 meters offshore, spotlight sweeping the water, then continued east. Gone. At 00205, the British MTB cut its engines and drifted in. Keller waded out, chest deep, and handed the map. Case to a Royal Navy lieutenant who didn't say a word, just nodded, turned, and disappeared back into the boat. The MTB was gone in under 2 minutes. Keller and his team climbed back up the cliffs and waited for dawn. June 6th, 0430 hours. The naval bombardment began. Offshore, battleships and cruisers opened fire, their guns so loud that even 8 kilometers inland, Keller could feel the concussion in his chest. The sky turned orange. The cliffs shook. For 30 minutes, the Allies poured high-explosive shells onto every bunker position Keller's team had marked. Some of the bunkers were destroyed outright, direct hits that caved in roofs and collapsed walls. Others were damaged enough to render their guns inoperable. A few survived intact, but their crews were disoriented, deafened, bleeding from ruptured eardrums, unable to coordinate fire. When the first landing craft hit the beaches at 0630, the German response was deadly but disorganized. The bunkers that should have slaughtered entire waves of infantry were silent, buried, or firing blind. Men still died, hundreds of them. Omaha Beach was chaos, blood, smoke, bodies floating in the surf. But it wasn't the massacre. It could have been. The guns that should have turned the tide didn't, because 2 weeks earlier 12 engineers had walked through occupied France with tape measures and sketch pads and mapped the invisible. Keller and his team stayed behind enemy lines for another 3 days, linking up with advancing infantry units from the 29th Division on June 9th. By then, the beachhead was secure. The invasion had succeeded. No one outside of Corps of Engineers Command knew what they had done. There were no medals, no press. The mission was classified until 1962, and even then, most of the details remained redacted. The official record listed it as reconnaissance operations in support of Operation Overlord. Keller went back to building airstrips. Pryor survived the war, went home to Oregon, and never talked about it. But the map they made, the one handed off to a British MTB in the dark, was copied, distributed, and used to refine Allied tactics for every subsequent amphibious landing in Europe. The method they developed, small teams, close reconnaissance, detailed engineering assessment under fire, became doctrine. And the bunkers themselves, the ones that survived, are still there. You can see them today, half buried in the dunes above Omaha Beach, concrete stained with rust and salt water, slowly being reclaimed by grass and sand. Tourists walk past them. Kids climb on them. Most people don't stop to read the plaques. But if you stand inside one, in the dim light, filtering through the firing slit, you can still see the geometry, the angles, the coldly efficient design meant to maximize death, and you can imagine what would have happened if no one had known they were there. Pause. 15,000 characters reached. Say okay to continue. Tentar novamente, gok the invasion planners had assumed the bunkers would be there. Everyone knew the Atlantic Wall existed, but assumptions don't win wars. Measurements do, angles do. Knowing that a gun emplacement at grid reference 49.3742 degree on can traverse 47 degrees and fire 220 rounds per hour makes the difference between a bombardment that destroys and a bombardment that merely disturbs. Keller's map gave the Navy that precision. But what came after D-Day, what the mission revealed about the way wars are actually won, mattered even more than the invasion itself. July 1944, somewhere in Normandy, behind the new front lines, the engineers were still there. Not Keller's team. They had been rotated back to England, but others like them, men from the same units, trained in the same methods. The breakout from the beachhead was grinding forward through hedgerows and farm fields, and every kilometer revealed more fortifications, bunkers, pillboxes, reinforced observation posts, artillery shelters dug into hillsides with walls thick enough to survive anything short of a direct hit from a battleship. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying France. They hadn't just built defenses along the coast. They had built them in depth, layered, redundant, designed so that even if the Allies took the beaches, they would bleed out in the interior, and no one had maps for most of it. The intelligence staff back in London had estimates, reconnaissance photos, informant reports, but estimates don't tell you whether a bunker's ventilation system can be blocked to force surrender, or whether the roof is reinforced enough to withstand a satchel charge, or whether there's a rear exit that lets the defenders escape and reoccupy the position after you think you've cleared it. So the Corps of Engineers started doing what Keller had done, but at scale. Teams of 3 to 5 men embedded with infantry units, moving ahead of the main advance to scout fortifications. They carried surveying tools, sketch pads, explosives, and portable radios. When they found a bunker, they didn't just call in an airstrike. They assessed it, measured it, decided whether it was worth destroying or whether it could be bypassed, suppressed, or, in some cases, captured intact and turned into an Allied strongpoint. This wasn't heroic. It was methodical, boring even in the way that survival engineering is boring when you're doing it right. But it kept the advance moving. It saved lives, and it taught the Army something that would reshape military engineering for the next 50 years. Fortifications are only as strong as your ignorance of them. The doctrine that came out of Normandy was formalized in a manual published in early 1945, Field Engineering Under Combat Conditions, Reconnaissance and Neutralization of Fixed Defenses. It was dry, technical, filled with diagrams of rebar spacing and explosive charge calculations. But buried in the appendices was a section on rapid assessment methodology, the system Keller's team had improvised in May 1944. It worked like this: approach at night, avoid engagement, locate ventilation shafts, firing slits, access doors, measure wall thickness using a steel probe or by tapping and listening for resonance, sketch interior layout if entry is possible, calculate the minimum ordnance required for neutralization, mark the position on a map with standardized symbology so that artillery, air support, or follow-on infantry know exactly what they're dealing with. Simple, efficient, and it worked because it didn't try to destroy everything. It categorized, prioritized. Some bunkers could be left alone if they didn't control key terrain. Some could be suppressed with smoke or gas. Some had to be obliterated. But you couldn't make those decisions from 5 kilometers away, staring at a map. You had to go there. By the time the war in Europe ended, the Corps of Engineers had mapped, assessed, or destroyed over 6,000 fortified positions across France, Belgium, and Germany. Some of them were massive, multi-level command bunkers with walls 3 meters thick, ventilation systems, independent power, supply caches that could sustain a garrison for weeks. Others were crude, log and earth pillboxes thrown together in a few hours. But all of them, at some point, had been measured by men with tape measures. And after the war, when the rubble was cleared and the occupation began, Allied engineers did something unexpected. They didn't demolish the bunkers. Most of them anyway. The ones along the coast, the ones that were too damaged to be useful, yes, those were buried or blown up. But the intact ones, the ones in decent condition, were left standing. Some were repurposed as storage. Some became shelters for displaced persons. A few were even turned into temporary housing while towns were rebuilt. Because good concrete doesn't care who poured it. The bunkers the Germans built were over-engineered, designed to last decades. And in the chaos of post-war Europe, when there was no steel, no timber, no brick, when entire cities were rubble, those bunkers became infrastructure. Aid organizations used them. Reconstruction crews used them. Refugees used them. The fortifications built to kill became, in their strange afterlife, tools of survival. But the real legacy wasn't the bunkers themselves. It was the way. The mission changed how militaries thought about intelligence and engineering. Before Keller, before Normandy, reconnaissance was mostly the job of pilots and spies. Engineers showed up after the fighting to build bridges and repair roads. They weren't supposed to be forward observers. They weren't supposed to infiltrate enemy territory and measure things. After Normandy, that changed. The idea that engineering knowledge could be a combat advantage, that understanding how something was built could tell you how to destroy it or bypass it or use it, became embedded in military planning. Engineers started training alongside infantry. Combat engineer battalions became standard in every division. Sapper units, originally just demolitions experts, expanded their role to include reconnaissance, assessment, and rapid fortification analysis. And that model spread. The Soviet Union, observing Allied tactics, developed its own engineering reconnaissance units. Same concept. Small teams, deep insertion, detailed reporting on enemy infrastructure. The British formalized it into the Royal Engineers Field Survey role. Even after the war, when the front lines froze into the Cold War, the doctrine persisted, because even in peacetime, knowing what the other side had built and how to defeat it mattered. The bunker at Pointe du Hoc, the one Keller's team measured on June 2nd, became a test case. After the war, Army engineers studied it intensively, analyzing the damage from naval bombardment, infantry assault, and demolition charges. They calculated exactly how much explosive force had been required to neutralize each firing position. They wrote reports on optimal shell trajectories for engaging reinforced coastal fortifications. Those reports informed the design of bunker-busting munitions for the next 40 years. And then, decades later, the method jumped from military to civilian. In the 1970s, structural engineers working on earthquake retrofit projects in California started using similar assessment techniques: portable tools, rapid surveys, prioritization matrices, to evaluate thousands of old buildings and determine which ones needed reinforcement and which ones were already safe. The logic was the same. You can't retrofit every building, so you need a system to figure out which ones matter. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, FEMA engineers used bunker assessment protocols to survey damaged structures in South Florida, categorizing them by severity so that rescue and demolition crews knew where to focus. Same principle: measure, map, prioritize. After 9/11, structural engineers assessing damaged buildings in Lower Manhattan borrowed techniques from combat engineering manuals, methods for evaluating blast-damaged concrete under hazardous conditions, for determining whether a structure could be stabilized or needed to be brought down. The lineage wasn't always direct. Most of the civilian engineers didn't know they were using military doctrine, but the DNA was there. The idea that you could walk into a damaged, dangerous structure, take measurements, and make life-or-death decisions based on geometry and material science, that started in earnest with men like Keller, crawling through German bunkers in the dark. Keller himself never thought of it that way. He went back to Pennsylvania after the war, resumed his civilian career, designed water treatment plants and highway bridges. He didn't talk much about Normandy. When asked, he would say it was reconnaissance work and leave it at that. He died in 1979, age 69, and his obituary mentioned his engineering projects but not the mission. Pryor, the demolition sergeant, lived longer. He gave one interview in the 1980s to a military historian researching Operation Overlord. In it, he said, "We weren't heroes. We were just guys with measuring tapes. But I think we did something that mattered. Because when you're about to send 10,000 men onto a beach and you don't know what's waiting for them, well, that's when 2 weeks of walking around in the dark with a notebook starts to look like a pretty good idea." The historian asked if he'd been scared. "Every single night," Pryor said. "Today the bunkers are monuments, protected, preserved as historical sites. You can tour them. There are guided walks, interpretive plaques, museum exhibits explaining how they were built, how they were used, how they were destroyed or survived. But what the plaques don't usually say is this: the reason those bunkers didn't kill more people on D-Day wasn't because they were poorly designed. They were extremely well designed. It wasn't because the Germans didn't have enough men or ammunition. They did. It was because 12 engineers spent 2 weeks walking through occupied France with tape measures, sketch pads, and flashlights, and wrote everything down. And then someone read what they wrote and used it. There's a broader truth here, one that transcends Normandy, transcends war. Engineering is only as good as the information it's built on. You can have the best ships, the best planes, the best soldiers in the world, but if you don't know what you're up against, really know, not guess, not estimate, but measure and document and understand, you're just hoping. And hope is a terrible strategy. Keller's mission worked because it replaced hope with data. It turned the unknown into the known. It gave commanders the ability to make decisions based on reality instead of assumptions. And that's what engineering, at its core, always does. It takes the terrifying uncertainty of the world and turns it into something you can calculate, something you can plan for, something you can, if you're good and a little lucky, survive. The bunkers on Omaha Beach were designed to be invisible, to be unknown, to kill from the shadows. Keller's team pulled them into the light, and in doing so, they saved more lives than any single bombardment, any single assault, any single act of courage on the beach that morning. Because before you can fight something, you have to see it. And before you can see it, someone has to go there and look.